What Adam was called to do was to build a city, to build the city of God. After his fall, we see that his descendants, they're building cities. It's just that they're building the wrong kinds of cities. They're building cities dedicated to idolatry and violence, and essentially they're building the city of man, as Augustine would say, or the city of Satan. That theme of city building and building the city of God, it works its way through the whole of Scripture. And at the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, we see that it's the last Adam who finally does build the city of God. I was actually a pastor in Mississippi for a few years before going to Peru. I studied at Reformed Seminary in Jackson, was a student pastor while I was there. And then after graduating and being ordained and staying on at a church there in that area, then Alonso Ramirez, a Peruvian pastor, came to study there to do doctoral work. And so we became fast friends, and I began to learn a lot more about Peru. And another classmate of mine, Bill Bradford, he had graduated with me. He was already planning to go to Peru at the time with MTW, and had it all lined out, was already raising his support. And then when Alonso got there, and we all started talking and spent a lot of time praying together and conspiring together, we took a trip down to Peru in 1996 and visited all over the country. And came back from there and told our wives, honey, pack the bags. The Lord's calling us to Peru. So, then initially it was the three of us, Alonso Ramirez, Bill Bradford, and myself. But then another fella who actually grew up as a next door neighbor to Bill Bradford, his name is Brad Ball. He had been in Argentina for a couple of years right when he got out of college. He and his wife were teaching English down there, and so he kind of had an itch to go back to Latin America. So he joined our team as our team deacon and administrator. Let's see, Bill got down there in 1999, and then I got there at the beginning of 2000. We went first to the mountain city of Cajamarca. That's where Pizarro captured the Incan emperor and put him to death. And we were there for 2 years, and then Brad and his family and me and my family, we went down to the coast, down to the city of Trujillo. Our initial vision was to start in Cajamarca, but to work through all the major cities in the north. And at the time, a little naively perhaps, we thought, well, a few years, maybe 10 years, we'll work through all the cities and plant churches in all those cities, and we'll be done and head back to the States. Well, here we are almost 20 years later, and we're still just in our second city, but we've enjoyed our time there, and the Lord's done some good things in spite of us. I think it was really just more the connection with Alonso than anything else. I've often said that I could be content in outer Mongolia if I thought I could be useful there. I have at times wondered, now why didn't we go to Mexico instead? That would be a little closer to the United States. But Peru's been great. We love the country, and lots of opportunities there. Lots of opportunities for doing good work. Well, there had been other missionaries in Peru before we were. The Free Church of Scotland started the work there in 1917. They had missionaries in Lima, and then a couple of years later, some missionaries went to Cajamarca and planted a few churches in the area. And they had been there off and on over the decades. Alonso was actually converted there in Cajamarca through the ministry of a Free Church missionary. They planted one church in the center of the city, and then a few churches out in the villages around there. And so we were kind of following up on that work. Over the years as well, There were some Dutch missionaries that have worked in Lima, up in the mountains, some out in the jungle. So in some ways we're kind of following on those two, well, the Scottish mission and the Dutch mission. American missionaries, Presbyterian missionaries, had worked in the south, but there weren't many of them that ever got up to the north. So we were, in some ways, perhaps following up on the Scottish and the Dutch works there. But for the most part, we've been doing our own thing. We've been planting new churches and not so much building on what they've done as expanding beyond that. Well, when we went down there, we said we want to plant churches, we want to start university ministries in all the universities there, we want to have a seminary, and we want to start schools. And so those were the four things that we talked about initially. And after being down there for a while, the vision began to develop a bit and mature, and I think it's matured. I hope so. And it really was after getting down to Trujillo. We were about almost 2 years in Cajamarca, and then been down in Trujillo for almost 18 now. And it was there that we started the medical ministry. And I guess I should tell a little bit about what exactly we're doing there. When we got to Trujillo, we initially started helping out with two works that had kind of been abandoned by previous church planters. There was a piece of property in one part of the city, and there was a little band of about 10 or 12 people in the other part of the city. And so we started out helping those two works, but then also started planting churches ourselves. And so over the years, we've worked to sort of replant those initial two works, and then we've planted 3 other churches besides that, and hope to do a whole lot more in the future. But it was in Trujillo also that we started out with the medical ministry. We started a medical clinic in a neighborhood called Wichensau, where we have one church, and then a few years later we started another medical clinic in a neighborhood called Arevalo. So we started the medical ministry there. We started the university ministry at the tail end of the year 2002. And Trujillo is a big educational center for the north of Peru. We have 11 universities there, and somewhere around 100,000 students at any given time. So that's been a key part of what we're doing. And a few years later, we started a microfinance bank. We sort of fell into that. We had an intern from the States who was working with us teaching English at the time, and he says to us one day, he says, "Have you ever thought about doing microfinance?" And we said, "Well, yeah, we thought about it a little bit, but we don't know anything about it, and don't have anyone who can get that started for us." And he says, "Well, actually, that's what my degree was in college. Would y'all mind if I write up the project and raise the money for it?" And so we said, "Knock yourself out. That sounds great." So that got us off into the microfinance, and then we started the seminary fairly soon there. And let's see, what else do we have going on? We have a summer camp for kids there. We also we have the school, right? And just about 18 months ago, we started a new program that's called Christ Kids, or Niños de Cristo. That is, it's a child development program for kids that are growing up in extreme poverty, and it's providing. It's a sponsorship program, kind of like Compassion International does, but it provides a full medical plan for these kids in our clinics. It provides a nutritional plan for them, where they come to the church and get nutritious meals. They also participate in a tutoring program where we've hired some professional teachers to work with them on reading comprehension and math skills. And then each one of them also, all these kids also participate in a Bible club there in the church. And that's been interesting because of the way that it really integrates everything else that we're doing around the mission. Perhaps I'll have occasion to say a little bit more about that later on. Yeah, I think probably what's distinctive about what we're trying to do there, in comparison to perhaps other missions, is what we say in our purpose statement or our mission statement: building the city of God in the urban centers of northern Peru. And that's really built on, I think, a reading that shouldn't be distinctive. It shouldn't be different, but because I think it's the right reading. But it's founded on a particular reading of the Great Commission, where so many missiologists in our day, they read Matthew 28, where Jesus says, "Go and make disciples," and they read that as if it were only about personal evangelism and personal discipleship. Whereas I think, if you read the passage in its context, it's talking about a whole lot more than just personal evangelism and personal discipleship. I recently in our seminary taught through the Gospel of Matthew and enjoyed. I didn't have your commentary on Matthew yet, but I did have your introductory essay. And but anyway, one of the really good points that you make in that essay and also in the commentary is that the Great Commission in Matthew's Gospel can't be understood without understanding at least three passages from the Old Testament. And one of them, and the most obvious within the literary structure of Matthew, is the decree of Cyrus, where Cyrus tells the Jews to go back and to build the city of Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. And so when Jesus issues the Great Commission, at least within the literary structure of Matthew, he has in mind this idea of building the city of God. And I think that's clarified even more when we sort of take even a broader angle, lens or approach to the passage, and notice the connection between Matthew 28 and the dominion mandate in Genesis 1, where Adam is called to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, and to have dominion over the earth. And again, if you look at that within the context of the book of Genesis and the whole theme, the unfolding theme there of city building, we can see that what Adam was called to do was to build the city of God. After his fall, we see that his descendants, they're building cities. It's just that they're building the wrong kinds of cities. They're building cities dedicated to idolatry and violence, and essentially they're building the city of man, as Augustine would say, or the city of Satan. But later, that theme of city building and building the city of God, it works its way through the whole of Scripture. And at the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, we see that it's the last Adam who finally does build the city of God. And all of those themes of the Garden of Eden with the tree of life and the river of life and all of that, and the precious stones that are in gold that are downriver in Havilah. Well, in the book of Revelation, we see that Jesus, the last Adam, has finally built that city. He's taken what was a garden, a beautiful garden, but a still undeveloped garden, and he has turned it into a glorious city. And so in Matthew 28, when we look at what Jesus is, when we see what he's talking about there and what he's calling his church to participate in, he's calling the church to participate in that initial or original vision of city building the city of God. And so that, I would argue that that's the second key passage that we need to see there. And another one important passage in the background of that is the commission of Joshua and the armies of Israel to go into the land and take possession of the land, and to build the godly culture and civilization that God had been explaining to them in the book of Deuteronomy and elsewhere. And so when we look at the Great Commission, it's more than just a charge to go and make disciples of individuals. It's a charge to build the city of God. And I think it's important to see, to understand that commission also in the context of where we are in the world today. The world we live in has over 7 billion people. Well over half of them live in cities, and about a third of those who live in cities are living in extreme poverty. And that's actually a situation very similar to what we find in the early church in the first few centuries, where the Roman Empire was very much an urban empire, and the apostles went out and planted churches in these cities, in these urban settings. But what they found in these urban settings was not the city of God. They found the city of Satan. They found urban settings that were filled with violence, and that were filled with sickness and disease, and filled with everything bad about the world. But it was precisely in that context, and preaching the gospel that Jesus has charged us to preach, that the city of God began to blossom and grow and flourish in the cities of the ancient world. And so today we find ourselves in a world that in so many ways is just like the world of the first few centuries. It's just exponentially bigger. A world filled with these massive, sprawling cities, like in Peru, for example. Go to Lima, go to Trujillo, go to any of the major cities on the coast, and you just see miles and miles of shanty towns. And so, as I often say, there's not much out there but dirt and people. It consists of people who have moved in from the mountains, moved in from the countryside area. They're moving to the city because they hope to find work. They hope to find some way of getting ahead in life, but they're typically relegated to the margins of society. They don't know anyone there. It's not like they're living there with family and friends. There's no semblance of community there. And what they tend to do is lie and cheat each other and rob and steal from each other and maim and kill each other. But what the gospel does when it goes into a place like that is that it not only reconciles those individuals to God vertically, it also begins to reconcile them amongst themselves, and it begins to build them up as a community of God's people. And I would argue that that's what this theme of the city of God is actually about in the Bible. It's an image of the church, but the church not as the assembly on the Lord's Day, but rather a little different image, the image of the church as a community, as a visible community in the world, as a social and political entity in the world. And so, as we've started the work and been engaged in the work in Peru, we've said, all right, here are all these massive cities. There's so much need, so much poverty, sickness and disease, and all these things. So what should it look like then to go into these cities, to preach the gospel, and to build up the church as the city of God, to build a Christian community, a Christian society? What does that need to look like? And it's really a result of thinking about what that should look like that has led us to develop the different ministries that we have. And I have no doubts that it's going to be different in different places. It's not going to look the same in Birmingham, Alabama as it does in Trujillo, Peru. But at least in our context in Trujillo, Peru, the idea of planting churches, and along with each church a school and a clinic, microfinance bank, working with the poor, working with kids that are growing up in extreme poverty, that perhaps are malnourished, but also working in the universities and developing a seminary to be able to raise up new church planters and new pastors. All of that is a community vision, a vision to build the city of God in the midst of these the cities of Satan, or cities of man, as Augustine would call them.